What starts as a simple whiskey mishap in Lochdubh quickly turns into chaos, pulling Hamish Macbeth into a mess far stronger than the spirit itself. In this village, even a cracked barrel can hide a troubling secret. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. He mist that rolled into Lochdubh before dawn was the sort that clung to the skin like damp wool and made even familiar shapes turn strange. Hamish Macbeth walked the loch path with Lugs trotting a few paces ahead, the dog's ears flicking toward every faint sound drifting across the still water. Hamish's long, lanky frame hunched slightly against the cold drizzle soaking through his old jacket, though he would never admit the chill bothered him. Weather in Lochdubh had its own moods, and he had learned long ago to move with them quietly. Lugs paused, nose lifting, sensing something unsettled in the morning air. Hamish crouched beside him, peering through the fog toward the village where faint lantern lights glowed behind frosted windows. "Aye, lad," he murmured. "Something's stirring." The path led them past the kirk and toward Patel's shop, where the bell above the door jingled even before Hamish reached it. Patel stepped outside, wrapped in a thick jumper, breath puffing white. "Constable Macbeth, have you heard?" Patel whispered in a conspiratorial panic. Hamish's internal thoughts remained short and dry. Too early for gossip, but gossip never sleeps here. Aloud he asked, "Heard what?" "The distillery's missing a barrel. Entire shipment gone overnight. Mrs. McPhee is beside herself. Folk are saying thieves, or worse." Hamish didn't indulge the dramatics. Patel always delivered news with more seasoning than truth required. Still, a missing whiskey barrel was no small matter in Lochdubh. Whiskey meant pride, livelihood, grudges older than most of the sheep. Hamish nodded. "I'll take a look." Patel leaned closer. "Folk are saying they heard a motor late last night. Strange for the weather." Hamish filed that away quietly, the way he always did, before continuing up the road with Lugs at his side. The drizzle thickened as they ascended toward the distillery road. Pools of water gleamed in low ruts where farm carts had passed. Hamish's gaze sharpened on a set of tyre tracks oddly clean and deeply cut into the mud. Not from one of the usual village vehicles. These were heavier, fresher, and had no business being there after midnight. "Some fool's been out, when better kept indoors," he murmured. Lugs growled low, confirming the sense of disturbance. The distillery yard emerged from the fog as a cluster of indistinct shapes, gradually sharpening into fretful villagers standing near the storage sheds. Hamish approached quietly. The chatter stopped at once, not out of fear, but because the villagers instinctively deferred to Hamish in times of confusion. They trusted him in a way Strathbane never understood. Agnes Fraser, arms folded tightly across her chest, stepped forward. "It's a mess, Hamish. Robbie Sinclair was first to spot it gone, and now we can't find either barrel nor man." "Where's Mrs. McPhee?" Hamish asked. "In her office, fretting. She's not herself." Hamish walked across the yard, scanning the ground with habitual care. Mud churned, footprints overlapping, nothing helpful. Lugs sniffed at the air, tense and alert. A faint scent drifted on the cold breeze. Sharp, metallic, wrong. Then someone shouted from the loch side. Hamish was already moving, his long stride carrying him quickly across the puddled ground, Lugs bounding close behind. The villagers followed at a hesitant distance, breath misting. The missing barrel lay cracked open on its side near the water's edge. The boards were splintered, whiskey soaked into the earth and mingling with the scent of algae. But the real horror was beside it. Robbie Sinclair sat slumped against the ruined barrel, eyes half open, skin a disturbing pale grey. His hands rested loosely in his lap as though he had simply grown tired and drifted off. No blood, no sign of violence, just stillness far too final. A woman gasped behind Hamish. Someone muttered a prayer. Hamish knelt carefully beside Robbie. Lugs pressed close, whining softly, ears flat. Hamish felt the faintest thread of cold dread coil beneath his ribs, though his face showed nothing beyond quiet focus. Robbie had been a man prone to bluster and envy, not malice, not the sort to meet death by the loch in silence. Hamish leaned close, inhaling gently. The usual sting of whiskey was there, but beneath it, something else, chemical, faint but unmistakable. He touched Robbie's wrist. Cold, stiffening. Hamish exhaled slowly. "He's gone." A murmur swept the small crowd. Shock, guilt, fear. each echoing differently from villager to villager. Lochdubh did not take death lightly, even when the dead were troublesome in life. The gossip would spread like fire across heather within the hour. Agnes stepped forward. But he was fine yesterday. Complained about overtime, but Robbie always complained. Hamish stood, brushing mud from his hands. There's no sign of a struggle, no fall, no blow to the head. Then what happened to him? Someone asked. Hamish's thoughts remained dry, quiet. Something he touched, something he breathed, but aloud he said only, "I'll need to speak to folk. Best ye head home for now." Villagers began drifting back up the path, subdued, their usual muttering traded for uneasy silence. Lochdubh loved a mystery, so long as no one died in the process. This one would unsettle the village in ways they hadn't felt since the last tragedy years ago. Hamish stayed until they'd gone, staring at the cracked barrel and the pale face leaning against it. Lugs whined again, sensing his master's tension. Hamish lowered himself to one knee and examined the splintered wood more closely. One shard stood out, darker at the edges, not from whiskey but something harsher. He ran his fingertip lightly across it and brought it to his nose. A faint chemical sting pricked his senses. Unmistakable. "Not whiskey alone," he murmured. He rose and gently guided Lugs away from the body. "Come on, lad, we've work ahead." As they walked back toward the path, the faint sound of a vehicle drifted from the distant road. Strange timing for so early in the morning, and stranger still after a body had been found. But by the time Hamish reached the gate to look, the sound had already faded into the fog. Rain began again, soft and steady, the kind Lochdubh accepted as naturally as breathing. Hamish paused, turning once more toward the loch. Robbie's quiet, unmarked death troubled him deeply. Not because of its violence, there was none, but because of its silence. Folk who died peacefully usually died in bed, surrounded by kin, not beside stolen whiskey barrels. Lugs nudged his leg, leaning in for reassurance. Hamish stroked the dog's head, gaze fixed on the mist-shrouded distillery buildings. "This isn't an accident. Not for a minute." He started up the path toward the village. Ahead lay gossip, suspicion, and likely Strathbane's heavy-handed meddling. Blair would appear soon enough, eager to claim authority, and equally eager to blame Hamish for whatever inconvenienced him. But none of that mattered yet. The investigation, as always, would begin quietly. A soft question here, a gentle prod there, bits of gossip tucked away like seeds waiting for the right weather to sprout. Hamish Macbeth had never needed force or clever speeches, only patience, only kindness, only the ability to see the small truths hiding behind larger lies. At the bend of the road, he paused, looking back once more at the loch. The mist curled thicker around the cracked barrel and the pale body beside it, swallowing them slowly. Hamish felt the familiar knot of responsibility settle in his chest. "Aye, Robbie," he whispered, "we'll find out what happened to you." He turned toward Lochdubh, with Lugs trotting faithfully beside him, as the cold Highland morning opened into the beginning of a case that would tangle the village in quiet shadows. The mist thickened, and Hamish walked forward into it. The fog did not lift as the morning dragged itself into day. It thickened instead, curling low over Lochdubh as if it meant to swallow both water and village whole. Hamish stood beside the cracked whiskey barrel, its ruined staves jutting like broken ribs. Lugs hovered near his knee, uneasy, his ears flicking at every distant scrape of sound across the damp yard. The mist pressed in from every direction, soft but insistent, and even the gulls seemed unsure of their bearings, circling once before disappearing into the greyness. Hamish rubbed the back of his cold neck, thinking in that short, clipped way he had. Robbie Sinclair had been alive last night, a bit of a worrier, fond of muttering over small slights and imagined injustices, but alive all the same. Now he was slumped against the ravaged barrel with no sign of a struggle, no mark on him, no visible cause at all. It was the sort of death that left too many questions and not nearly enough answers. He crouched beside the barrel again, his fingers brushing the damp soil where whiskey had soaked in. A faint chemical sharpness mingled with the usual smell of malt. It pricked at his nose but vanished too quickly for certainty. Lugs whined and backed away, the dog's instincts sharper than any man's. Hamish took a sliver of wood near the crack and slipped it quietly into his pocket. He didn't know why yet, but something about the colour of it bothered him. From the road came the low grumble of an engine, then another, a whole string of them. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Strathbane, of course. The first police car rattled over the potholes like a metal tin kicked downhill. Its headlights cut faintly through the fog before two more cars followed, forming a procession of authority no one in Lochdubh had asked for. Doors flew open with needless aggression, and the familiar bellowing voice carried across the yard, even before the man himself appeared. "Well, well, Macbeth," Inspector Blair called, storming toward him with the subtlety of an angry bull. "I should have known you'd be here, poking about where you've no business." Hamish rose slowly, brushing dirt from his trousers. "I am the village constable, sir," he said mildly. "Folk tend to expect me." "They expect too much. That's their trouble," Blair snapped. His cheeks were already flushed with irritation, and his coat strained against the wind as if even the weather refused to cooperate. Anderson trailed behind him with his usual smirk of obedience, clutching a clipboard like it might earn him promotion through enthusiasm alone. Crofters and villagers had gathered at the edges of the yard, watching the spectacle with thin-lipped disapproval. Blair turned on them at once. "Right, you lot. Anyone touching anything? Anyone see anything? Anyone breathing too close to my crime scene?" Mrs. Duff, who had lived long enough to tolerate very little nonsense, replied, "It's not your crime scene, Inspector. Hamish was here first." Blair sputtered. Anderson scribbled. Hamish stepped lightly between them before Blair could explode into a full tantrum. "I've kept people back," Hamish said. "Folk were only concerned. Robbie worked with them." "Robbie drank himself into a stupor and tripped over a damned barrel," Blair said. "You can tell by the smell." Hamish didn't answer. There had been whiskey, yes, but not the sour reek of someone drinking himself to death. Robbie's breath had smelled faintly of malt and something else, something sharper. But Blair wasn't interested in subtleties. Blair stomped toward the body, waving Anderson along. "Get your notes ready. We'll wrap this up in 10 minutes. Hamish doubted that very much. Strathbane never wrapped anything up quickly unless it spared them paperwork. While Blair barked questions at random villagers, Hamish drifted toward the distillery buildings. The fog wrapped around him like damp wool. A few workers stood clustered beneath an overhang, their faces pale in the cold. Mrs. McPhee, the manager, pushed her glasses up her narrow nose and looked at Hamish with a combination of relief and embarrassment. "Constable Macbeth," she said, "it's a terrible business. Robbie was, well, he was Robbie. Always complaining about something, but he did his work." "He'd been arguing with anyone more than usual?" Hamish asked gently. She hesitated, smoothing the front of her jumper. "Nothing serious. Jealousy over promotions. A bit of money trouble, perhaps. There were rumours he'd been taking Whisky home for testing purposes. Folk exaggerate." "Aye, they do." Hamish watched her eyes flick away, then return. Something about her posture suggested more guilt than grief. Before he could ask further, Blair shouted his name across the yard. Hamish offered Mrs. McPhee a small nod and turned back. Lugs followed quickly, pressing closer to Hamish's leg as if Blair's voice carried its own warning. "You finished larking about?" Blair demanded. "We've established the cause of death." "Oh," Hamish said. "A drunken fool. Man drinks himself senseless, knocks over a barrel, gets crushed and poisoned by fumes. It's obvious." Hamish studied the ground where the barrel lay. There were no markings on Robbie's body that suggested crushing. Blair knew that too, but he wanted a quick answer. Quick answers meant early lunches and shorter reports. "Aye, sir," Hamish murmured. "Obvious." Blair's triumphant smirk said he didn't catch the dry note in Hamish's tone. Anderson leaned forward. "Shall I write down that the constable agrees, sir?" Blair puffed up. "Of course he agrees." Hamish didn't bother arguing. Blair wasn't listening, and Anderson listened only to Blair. Better to let them talk themselves into a corner. The villagers were growing restless. Distillery workers whispered among themselves, glancing at Hamish with the quiet expectation that he would handle things properly once the Strathbane storm passed. Mrs. Wilson from the post office clutched her shawl around her shoulders and muttered that she'd never liked the look of the barrel yard at night, not with the fog rolling the way it did. A pair of fishers shook their heads, muttering about Robbie's temper and the way he'd been skulking about after hours. Hamish stored each remark away carefully. It was always the small comments that proved useful later. A familiar figure stepped through the mist then, Priscilla Halberton Smythe, elegant even with the damp clinging to her coat. She carried a thermos and offered it with a restrained, polite smile. "I thought you might need this," she said. Her voice was calm as ever, soft enough not to disturb the tension in the air. Hamish felt warmth rise to his ears despite the cold. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I'll be here a while." "I know." Her gaze drifted toward Blair, whose face was rapidly growing redder, as a crofter challenged one of his assumptions. "You'll sort things out. You always do." He didn't answer. She never said such things lightly, and the quietness between them settled like another layer of mist. She stayed only a moment longer before returning to her father's house on the hill, her silhouette fading into the grey. Hamish sipped the tea and let the heat settle in his chest before walking back to the barrel. Blair had moved on to scolding Anderson for smudging his own notes. The inspector was so absorbed in his irritation that he failed to notice Hamish kneeling again at the cracked wood. He touched the splintered edges lightly. The residue clinging there wasn't just whiskey. He had smelled it before somewhere, something used to clean industrial surfaces. Not enough to make a man drop dead at a touch, but perhaps enough if the fumes were trapped inside a sealed barrel that was never meant to be opened. Lugg stepped close and nudged Hamish's arm, letting out a low, uneasy sound. "I know," Hamish whispered. "Something's not right." From the loch came the faint slap of water against the jetty. The fog carried the sound strangely, stretching it out until it felt like an echo. Hamish straightened slowly, letting the weight of the scene settle into him. Robbie, pale against the mud. The barrel split like a wound. Blair thundering about drunkenness. Villagers whispering half-truths. A manager with too many worries, and a scent on the wood that didn't belong to Whisky at all. Hamish walked a few paces to the edge of the yard, looking out over Lochdubh. The mist lay heavy across its surface, turning water and sky into one unbroken sheet of dull silver. He felt the familiar quiet ache in his chest, the one that came whenever death paid a visit to the village. Robbie Sinclair hadn't been a saint, but no one deserved to end alone beside a broken barrel on a cold morning. He shoved his hands into his pockets and breathed in the cold air. Something about the death was wrong. Too clean, too empty, as if someone had hoped the fog would hide more than just the loch. Luggs leaned against his leg, waiting. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "We'll get to the bottom of it." He walked back toward the village, the fog closing behind him like a curtain. The rain arrived with a steady, miserable persistence, the sort that flattened the heather and turned every track into a thin stream. By the time Hamish left the distillery yard, the cold had worked its way through his jacket and down to his bones. Lochdubh lay half hidden behind a veil of grey, its surface ruffled by the wind. Luggs trotted beside him, pausing now and then to shake droplets from his coat, giving Hamish a reproachful look as if to say the weather was his fault. Hamish could not argue. In Lochdubh, bad news often seemed to summon bad weather. He walked the narrow road toward the crofts, his long stride carrying him past stone walls slick with rain. Smoke curled lazily from peat fires inside the small houses scattered across the hillside. Somewhere a sheep bleated in dull complaint. The village was awake, but reluctantly so, as though it resented being pulled into another mystery so soon after the last. Hamish sympathised. He felt the same way. Robbie Sinclair. Hot-tempered, quick to sulk, fond of dramatising his grievances. Yet he hadn't deserved to die against a broken barrel. Hamish felt a tug of sorrow for the man, unexpected but real. Death, in a place as small as Lochdubh, always left shadows longer than the moors. He reached the first croft, where Sandy Ross stood wrestling an old tarp over a stack of firewood. Sandy was a broad-shouldered man with a face permanently set into a look of polite irritation, as if life itself rarely behaved in a manner he approved of. When he spotted Hamish through the drizzle, he raised a hand in weary greeting. "You'll be wanting to ask about Robbie," Sandy said before Hamish even opened his mouth. "I heard the news before breakfast. Word travels faster than a storm in this village." Hamish stepped under the low roof of the shed for a moment's shelter. "Aye, I'm trying to piece together where he'd been these last few days. You worked with him at the distillery now and then?" Sandy grunted. "Helped shift a few barrels, that's all. Robbie was always wound up about something. Last week it was tourists. Said one of the lads, Dougie, was showing off for them, making him look slow." Sandy shook his head. "Foolish talk. Dougie's always been a charmer. Robbie never liked that in anyone." Hamish nodded, storing the detail away. Small jealousies often meant more than dramatic ones. "You see him yesterday?" Just after dusk. Storm was coming in. He went past my fields, muttering about folk not giving him proper respect. I didn't pay it heed. Thought he was heading to the loch. Strange time for a walk, mind you. Lugg sniffed at Sandy's boots, then gave a small huff, as though approving of the crofter's straightforward manner. Sandy bent to give him a brief scratch behind the ears. "Smart dog," he said, smarter than most folk Robbie mixed with. Hamish thanked him and moved on, climbing the damp hillside trail. The rain shifted direction as he walked, coming straight at him now in sharp slanted bursts. Lugg stayed close, pressing against his leg whenever the wind blew too fiercely. Hamish could feel the weight of the village on his shoulders, a familiar weight, but no lighter for its familiarity. Robbie's death had shaken folk, no matter what Blair announced. There were too many whispers, too much unease. At the next croft, an elderly woman named Morag Campbell answered Hamish's knock. She wore a heavy cardigan that looked older than Hamish himself, and her sharp eyes missed nothing. She ushered him inside with the briefest of welcomes, then sat him near the peat fire, which glowed warmly despite the thin draught sneaking under the door. "You'll be wanting to know what he was doing at the loch late at night," Morag said without preamble. Hamish lifted his head. "You saw him?" "I've eyes, haven't I?" she replied tartly. "A body can peer out a window whenever she likes." She stirred her tea with unnecessary vigour. "Robbie's been sneaking about the paths after midnight, more than once this week, always with that jumpy look, like he was expecting someone to come after him. I nearly went out to tell him to go home, but the rain was coming sideways and I've no interest in dying of pneumonia just to scold a fool." Hamish suppressed a smile. Morag had the air of someone who could cow a grown man with a single glance. "Did he meet anyone?" "No, just wandered near the loch edge, standing there staring at the water like it held an answer, fidgeting with his jacket pockets. I thought maybe he was drinking, but he never staggered, walked straight as a line." Hamish felt a quiet shift inside him. Robbie frightened? It didn't match the man he knew, unless something had frightened him badly indeed. "Did he speak to anyone lately? Any arguments?" "Oh, plenty," Morag sniffed. "Robbie argued with shadows if they looked at him wrong, but he had words with Colin Fraser 2 days ago. Loud words. Something about the distillery wasting good whisky and ruining the grazing land with runoff. Colin's cows haven't been well." Hamish filed it away. Another line to tug upon. He thanked Morag and left, bracing himself as the wind caught the door with a sharp crack behind him. The sky had grown darker still, though it wasn't yet midday. He trudged toward Colin Fraser's croft, boots sinking into the wet grass, lugs padding steadily at his side. Colin was waiting outside, arms crossed, rain dripping steadily from the brim of his cap. A crofter of few words, he regarded Hamish with the wary expression of someone who trusted the constable but disliked the attention of Strathbane. Hamish respected him for both. "You'll know why I'm here," Hamish said quietly. Colin jerked his head toward the byre. "Aye, poor bugger. Robbie wasn't easy to like, but he didn't deserve the loch for a grave. We found him by a broken barrel. Folks say you argued with him." Colin sighed heavily. "Aye, he said the distillery was cutting corners again, watering down whisky, dumping waste where it shouldn't go. I told him to mind his tongue unless he had proof. My cows are sick enough without me getting dragged into some fool rumour." "He seemed frightened?" Hamish asked. Colin considered. "Aye, but Robbie always seemed frightened of something, mostly himself." A sudden crash echoed from the byre. Lugs barked sharply and dashed ahead. Hamish darted after him, slipping slightly on the wet grass. A loose shutter flapped violently in the wind, banging against the wood. No danger, only weather. Still, Hamish felt his pulse quicken for a moment. Small tensions mattered. Fear moved freely through Lochdubh today. Hamish spent the next hour visiting fishers along the loch. Most shook their heads, offering fragments of truth tangled with gossip. Robbie had been boastful one day, surly the next. He'd claimed to know something important, though he never said what. One fisher remembered seeing him near the old jetty at dawn earlier in the week, pacing back and forth like a man deciding whether to jump in or run away. By the time Hamish reached the village centre, the rain had turned to a steady cold drizzle. Patel stood outside his shop, sweeping water away from the doorway with a resigned look. His spectacles were speckled with rain, and he pushed them up his nose with an impatient flick. "Constable Macbeth, busy morning, eh? You'll be after this." He disappeared briefly inside and returned holding a small receipt book. Someone bought cleaning chemicals yesterday. Strong stuff, industrial. Paid in cash. Hamish felt a small stir of interest. Who? A stranger. Coat pulled tight, hood up. Could have been anyone. But folk in Lochdubh don't buy chemicals unless they mean trouble or spring cleaning, and it's far too early for either. Hamish flipped the receipt open, though it revealed little. No names, no signatures. Only a date and a price. Still, it was something. As he stepped back into the misty street, Luggs nudged his leg again, giving a low, uneasy whine. Hamish followed his gaze toward the loch. The water shivered under the grey sky, dark ripples spreading outward from the centre, as if something had disturbed it beneath the surface. Leaving Lochdubh. Robbie had been planning to leave. He'd told no one, but Hamish had found a leaflet stuck inside Robbie's jacket pocket at the distillery, a folded brochure for a job in Inverness. Cleaner pay, steadier work, far from Lochdubh's gossips and grudges. Why hide it? Why stay silent? Rain pattered against the ground as Hamish stood still, thinking. People didn't hide good news unless they feared someone would spoil it. Robbie had been frightened, secretive, angry, and someone in the village had been keeping a secret of their own. Hamish's breath misted in the air as he turned back toward the crofts. There were too many half-truths floating around Lochdubh. Someone was lying. The trick, as always, would be finding who lied least. He whistled softly for Luggs, and together they walked into the deepening rain. The storm announced itself before it struck, rolling down from the moors with a low rumble that vibrated the damp air. Hamish felt it gather behind him as he walked the narrow road toward the distillery, Luggs trotting close to his side. A hard wind pushed sheets of cold rain across Lochdubh, hammering at the water until the loch looked like a great grey animal shuddering beneath the sky. Power lines swayed overhead, and the familiar flicker in the distant village windows told Hamish that electricity would not last long. He tugged his jacket tighter. The weather was never subtle in Lochdubh, especially when trouble lingered. By the time he reached the distillery yard, the wind had intensified to a shrill howl, threading between the buildings and snapping at loose shutters. Water pooled across the gravel surface, swirling around his boots in thin, restless rivers. The smell of wet grain and cold metal filled the air. Luggs shook himself violently, sending droplets flying, then pressed his body against Hamish as if to suggest returning home would be wiser. Hamish couldn't disagree, but the ruined whiskey barrel and Robbie Sinclair's pale body haunted every quiet corner of his thoughts. Inside the staff building, a small stove glowed weakly, giving off more light than heat. Hamish held his hands above it anyway, the warmth seeping slowly into his stiff fingers. The workers had gathered in a huddle near the benches, whispering in that low, uneasy way villagers adopted when they feared the truth might be worse than the gossip. Their clothes steamed faintly from the rain. Luggs sat at Hamish's feet, his gaze never leaving the employees. Hamish turned to Agnes Fraser, one of the senior workers. She had a face lined by years of worry and wind, and her hair was pinned back so tightly it gave her the look of perpetual startlement. "Agnes," he said gently, "you knew Robbie well enough. Did he speak to you about anything troubling him these last few days?" Agnes hesitated, then pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He said someone was messing with the batches," she whispered. "Said the whiskey tasted wrong, but Robbie said a lot of things. You ken how he was, always looking for slight where there was none." Hamish nodded. "Did he name anyone?" "No, just muttered about folk not minding their work, and about mistakes. Silly mistakes. He was fair riled." Luggs let out a low sound, not quite a growl, but enough to draw Hamish's eye. The dog's ears angled toward the far door as if he sensed something unseen behind it. Before Hamish could look closer, Willie Duncan, another distillery worker, stepped forward. He was a tall, wiry man with a nervous habit of tapping his fingers against his thigh. "Robbie was blackmailing someone," Willie blurted suddenly. "I shouldn't say it, but it's true. Heard him threatening them out by the mash tuns. Said he'd ruin them if he didn't get what was owed." Agnes gasped softly. "Willie, you don't know that." "I do," Willie insisted, though his voice trembled. He was desperate for money. Everyone knew it. And he said he'd found something big. Hamish studied him with that quiet, assessing gaze villagers both trusted and feared. Willie's eyes darted about too quickly. He wasn't lying, but he wasn't brave enough to tell the whole truth either. Hamish tucked the observation away. Another crack of thunder shook the walls. The lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied in a dim hum. Just as Hamish opened his mouth to probe further, the door slammed open so violently that Luggs jumped to his feet with a sharp bark. Inspector Blair barged in, dripping rain, red-faced with fury, and already shouting before anyone could react. "Macbeth, what are you doing here? I told you to leave this case to professionals." Hamish looked at him mildly. "Professionals, sir?" Blair ignored the tone, though Anderson, dripping behind him, stiffened with outrage on his superior's behalf. Blair's coat was soaked, clinging tight around his belly, and his thinning hair lay plastered to his scalp like wet seaweed. "You're meddling again," Blair snarled. "Interfering with statements, upsetting workers, poking your long nose where I was speaking to them, sir, that's all." "That's too much," Blair barked. "You're to stand down." Hamish blinked slowly. "Stand? Where, sir?" "Down!" Blair roared, waving his arms in a way that made Agnes flinch. Hamish nodded with false earnestness. "Aye, sir. Down. Of course." The workers watched Hamish with a mixture of pity and admiration. They had seen this dance before, Blair bellowing, Hamish pretending confusion, all while collecting more truth in 5 minutes than Blair could in 5 years. Blair stomped toward the door that had captured Luggs's attention earlier. "What's in here?" he demanded. "Storage," Agnes said quietly. "Nothing important." Blair rattled the handle and scowled. "Locked. Why is it locked?" "Because it's storage," Hamish said, following calmly. "Folk lock things sometimes." Blair shot him a venomous glare. "Open it!" Agnes fetched the key reluctantly. When she unlocked the door, the hinges groaned like something ancient waking. Inside, the room smelled strongly of varnish and wood. Barrels lined the walls, most neatly stacked. But Hamish stepped forward and touched one lightly. The paint was fresh compared to the others. Too fresh. Someone had repainted several barrels recently, though the job was subtle. Luggs growled, the sound deep and low. Hamish crouched beside a barrel near the back. The mark on the wood told him it had once held something different, not whiskey. Someone had tried to disguise it. Blair pushed past him. "Nothing here but barrels. You're wasting time." Hamish rose slowly. "Aye, sir. Barrels. Quite a lot of them." Blair stared at him, suspicious. Anderson scribbled something on his clipboard that would undoubtedly mean nothing. Before Hamish could ask Agnes another question, a sudden noise burst from the hallway, footsteps pounding, a door slamming, and the rapid crunch of gravel outside. Luggs barked sharply. Hamish darted toward the exit, narrowly avoiding Blair's flailing arm. Outside, the storm had worsened. Sheets of rain obscured the yard. Hamish caught sight of a figure running toward the road, slipping in the mud but not stopping. A worker. Young, slight, the same young man Hamish had noticed earlier hovering near the office door. "Hey!" Hamish called, though not loudly. The storm swallowed the sound. Hamish jogged after him, careful on the slick ground. The young man scrambled over the fence, catching his coat and ripping it, then vanished behind the storage shed. Luggs bounded after them both, barking encouragement. When Hamish rounded the shed, the worker had halted, hands raised in surrender, chest heaving. All right, the young man gasped. "I'm sorry. I took some whiskey, just a wee bit. I didn't want trouble." Hamish walked up to him, breathing steadily. "Whiskey, is it?" "I only took a dram or two. Robbie caught me last week. Threatened to tell Mrs. McPhee unless I shared." The young man swallowed hard. "I panicked. Thought you'd think I killed him." Hamish studied him. The fear was genuine, but not the kind attached to murder. Only guilt. Small, village-sized guilt. A red herring, nothing more. "Go home," Hamish said quietly, "and stop stealing whiskey. You're a dreadful liar." The young man nodded furiously and fled into the storm. Hamish stood alone for a moment, rain pounding against his face, Luggs at his heel. The wind tugged at his coat, and thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the hills. He looked back toward the dim outline of the distillery. Repainted barrels. Blackmail. Robbie frightened. Something hidden behind a sheen of varnish and a cracked cask that should never have killed a man. The pieces didn't fit yet, but the storm always churned up what lay beneath. Hamish turned toward Lochdubh, the loch's wild surface flashing silver under a stray bolt of lightning. A truth was hiding in the distillery, and the weather seemed determined to wash the lies free. He walked back through the rain, Luggs pressed close, both heading toward whatever waited next. The drizzle had softened to a light, persistent mist by the time Hamish made his way down the narrow road toward the Lochdubh Hotel. Evening pressed gently against the village, turning the air cold enough to creep beneath collars and settle along the bones. Lights glowed faintly in cottage windows, flickering through the haze like small, determined stars. The loch lay quiet, touched only by a thin rippling where rain still kissed its surface. Lugs padded beside him, pausing now and again to sniff at tufts of damp grass or raise his head toward distant sounds hidden in the fog. Hamish felt the day's weight dragging behind him like a long coat soaked through with rain. Robbie Sinclair's death had peeled open old tensions in Lochdubh. Jealousy, grudges, whispered suspicions. Folk were talking far too quickly and far too quietly, which meant truths were buried beneath the usual tangle of lies and pride. But something new had surfaced in the gossip. A stranger, seen long before dawn 2 nights ago, speaking with Robbie in the lee of the loch wall. Nobody had caught more than the shape of them in the mist, but a stranger in Lochdubh always stirred the pot. The hotel lounge glowed warm behind its rain-streaked windows, offering the promise of a fire and dry air. Hamish stepped inside, brushing droplets from his jacket. The room smelled of polished wood and old carpet, with a hint of whisky that clung to everything in Lochdubh, whether invited or not. A few tourists sat huddled near the hearth, murmuring about the weather as though it were a curious local custom rather than a permanent resident. Behind the bar stood Mrs. Farquhar, the hotel owner, bustling about with her usual precision, her lips set tight in the way that meant she had opinions she wouldn't yet share. But Hamish's attention went to the man seated alone at a corner table. Immaculate clothes, tailored too well for the Highlands. Dark hair slicked back in a style that belonged to Edinburgh or Glasgow offices, not muddy distillery yards. A pair of binoculars rested near his untouched plate, as though placed deliberately to support the story he would eventually tell. Most telling of all, mud clung to the man's boots. Not just any mud, the distinct grey-brown of the distillery yard, still drying in uneven patches. Hamish noted it in the quiet, inward way he always did. Lugs took one sniff of the stranger and immediately pressed close to Hamish's leg, uneasy. The man looked up with a start, smoothing his expression into something polite but strained. "Evening," he said, voice crisp, educated, and a fraction too careful. "Evening," Hamish replied mildly. "Damp night for a walk." "I've been bird-watching," the man said quickly, gesturing toward the binoculars. "Migratory patterns. Fascinating things." Hamish glanced at the window. The mist hung thick, swallowing the far shore entirely. "Aye, birds do like to hide in fog." The stranger smiled tightly. "They manage." Hamish eased himself into the chair opposite, his long limbs folding in that slightly awkward, lanky way that made him appear gentler than he was. "We dinna get many bird-watchers this time of year. And you're staying at the hotel?" "Yes," the man said. "A short visit. Needed some quiet." Lochdubh offered many things, but quiet in the midst of a suspicious death was not one of them. Hamish let the silence stretch, watching the man grow more fidgety with each passing second. His hand hovered near the binoculars as though they shielded him from questions. "You were at the distillery this afternoon," Hamish said, voice quiet, almost apologetic. The man blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Your boots," Hamish murmured. "Mud from the yard. Distillery mud's a wee bit different from lochside earth. Folk notice these things." The stranger shifted in his seat, his polished facade cracking just slightly. "Oh, yes, I went for a walk and wandered near the buildings, didn't realise it was private." Hamish offered a gentle nod. "Aye, easy mistake." He let another moment pass, then leaned in a fraction. "You staying long?" "Not sure yet." The stranger reached for a glass. Lemonade, Hamish noted, not whisky. Odd choice for someone visiting Lochdubh, where the locals practically baptised visitors in whisky culture. The stranger drank only non-alcoholic drinks, according to Mrs. Farquhar's earlier muttering. Another small detail added to the growing pile. Lugs gave a soft growl, not loud, but unmistakably distrustful. The man's smile tightened further. "Your dog doesn't seem to care for me." "Lugs has good instincts," Hamish said simply. Across the room, 2 villagers hunched over their pints near the hearth, their whispers carrying more than they intended. "That's the man Robbie was seen talking to," one muttered. "Aye, near the jetty. Looked like trouble, if you ask me." The other nodded solemnly, though neither had evidence beyond mist and imagination. The stranger heard them too. His jaw twitched. Hamish stood. "Mind if we speak outside for a moment?" The man hesitated, a telling hesitation, then rose. "Of course." They stepped into the cool drizzle. The hotel's doorway cast a small pool of yellow light that barely dented the mist. Beyond it, the village blurred into shapes and shadows. Lugs walked ahead, sniffing the air, bristling faintly. Hamish kept his voice soft, as though discussing the weather rather than the edges of a crime. Folk in Lochdubh talk. They say Robbie met someone before he died, someone he shouldn't have met alone. The stranger swallowed. Coincidences happen. Aye, they do, and sometimes they don't. Hamish studied him with gentle, steady eyes. What brought you to Lochdubh, truly? I told you, rest, a change of scenery. Folk who want rest don't usually tramp through storm mud near distillery yards, or talk to workers in the dark. The man froze. I didn't. Hamish held up a hand. No need. It'll come out eventually. Lochdubh has a way of squeezing truths free. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across the stranger's face. Not guilt, fear. Hamish tucked that away. Fear could mean innocence as easily as guilt, but either way, it meant connection. A car splashed down the lane, headlights slicing through the mist. The stranger flinched, then quickly composed himself. Constable Macbeth, he said stiffly. I assure you I had nothing to do with that man's death. Hamish nodded once. Maybe so, but you're not telling me everything. The stranger turned back toward the hotel door. Good night. He disappeared inside, leaving Hamish alone in the drizzle. Lugs pressed against his leg, tail stiff. Aye, boy, Hamish murmured. He's hiding something, but I dinna ken what. He walked toward the loch path, letting the mist settle on his hair and coat. The village dimmed behind him, its lights softened into halos. Down by the shore, the water lapped quietly, as though listening. As Hamish passed the distillery road, he caught movement. 2 silhouettes near the gate. The taller one was Mrs. McPhee, her profile unmistakable, and beside her stood the stranger. They spoke in low tones, their faces pale shapes beneath the dim security light. Hamish paused in the shadow of a shed, watching without being seen. Mrs. McPhee's hands trembled as she gestured. The stranger shook his head sharply. She looked frightened. It lasted only a moment before they parted, each slipping into the mist as though ashamed of being seen together at all. Lugs gave another low growl. Hamish walked on, troubled. The drizzle deepened into soft rain, soaking the small of his back beneath his jacket. He barely noticed. His thoughts wandered in the quiet, clipped way that shaped all his investigations. Robbie had known something, or thought he had. Someone else had bought cleaning chemicals with cash. Barrels had been repainted, disguising something just beneath the surface. And now a polished stranger was drinking lemonade in a whiskey village while meeting Mrs. McPhee after dark. Motives circled through Hamish's mind. Money, pride, anger, fear. Enough to knot the heart of anyone in Lochdubh. The loch breathed mist above its surface as he reached the shoreline path. Lugs walking ahead, pausing now and then to check on him with a soft, questioning whine. Folk are lying, lad, Hamish said quietly, and they're doing it softly. He paused, looking out at the grey water. Rain tapped the surface gently, rhythmic and steady. He felt that familiar heaviness again. Not despair exactly, but the melancholy that came whenever a village secret hovered just beyond reach. He turned back toward home, the faint glow of his cottage window waiting at the end of the path. Tomorrow, he murmured. We'll unravel it tomorrow. The mist swallowed his words as the loch breathed quietly in the dark. The fog on the moor had thickened overnight, settling low enough that Hamish felt as though he were walking inside a cold breath rising from the earth itself. Lugs trotted ahead, his shape a muted blur against the heather. The air smelled of wet peat and the faint tang of distant wood smoke drifting from Lochdubh's chimneys far below. Hamish's long stride carried him steadily uphill, the soft squelch of damp ground marking each step. Walking cleared his head better than any clever theory. Up here, the noise of villagers' suspicion softened until only the truth seemed to remain. But today even the moor felt uneasy. A shiver of wind passed across the ridge, making the gorse shudder. Hamish paused, listening. The fog muffled sound strangely, swallowing half of what should have reached him. Lugs raised his head sharply, ears pointed toward the higher slope. A soft scrape echoed, wood against stone perhaps, then a short rumble. Hamish blinked, stepping back as an empty whiskey barrel came rolling down the incline toward them. It wasn't fast enough to kill, but fast enough to bruise a man's shin or send him stumbling into a ditch. Hamish sidestepped it just in time. The barrel bounced once, then spun lazily before settling in a patch of heather. Luggs snarled, hackles rising, and charged up the slope. Hamish followed quickly, though the damp grass and fog slowed him. At the ridgeline, the air shifted again. A shape, faint and human-sized, slipped deeper into the mist. No footsteps carried back. No voice. Only the moor breathing. Hamish stood still, chest rising slowly. "A warning, then," he murmured. His thoughts remained spare and practical. Whoever pushed the barrel didn't want him dead. Only cautious. Only deterred. He gave a low whistle. Luggs trotted back toward him, still tense, eyes bright with unanswered challenge. Hamish scratched behind his ears. "Aye, I ken. They're nervous." They descended the moor path together, the fog curling inward as if to hide whatever secrets lingered above. The barrel's appearance troubled Hamish, though not for its danger. Warnings on the moor were subtle Lochdubh messages, a way of saying, keep out without raising gossip. Someone feared his questions. The kirk bell chimed faintly as Hamish reached the edge of the village. The whitewashed building stood calm amidst the damp, a breath of stillness in the grey morning. He tied Luggs by the low wall, though the dog protested with a sharp bark. "I'll only be a moment," Hamish promised. Inside the kirk, the dim light from tall windows cast pale stripes across polished wooden pews. The minister, Reverend McNair, stood arranging hymn books with meticulous care. He was a soft-spoken man with thinning hair and a gentle stoop, but his eyes were shrewd in a way that made confessions feel heavier. "Hamish," the Reverend said, setting down a book, "I thought you might come." Hamish nodded. "Folk say Robbie came to you last week." Reverend McNair lowered himself onto a pew as though bracing his thoughts. "He did. Looked a troubled soul, more troubled than usual. He carried shame with him. The way his shoulders sagged, you could see it plain. Something had eaten into him." "Did he say what?" "No. He spoke in circles. Said he feared he'd made a mistake, that someone might expose him, or worse, that he'd ruin something he loved if he spoke out." The Reverend sighed, clasping his hands. Fear and guilt often blur together. Robbie didn't know which one he felt more. "He say anything about the distillery?" Another pause. "Only that he had to set something right before leaving Lochdubh for good." So Robbie had been leaving, but the truth of why remained misted, as everything did in Lochdubh when secrets were at play. Hamish thanked the Reverend and stepped back outside. Luggs nuzzled his hand, as though relieved to be reunited. The drizzle had thickened again. Hamish walked toward Patel's shop, where gossip always flowed quicker than rain off a tiled roof. But halfway there, Colin Fraser, the crofter known for his bluntness and stubborn cows, hailed him from beneath the overhang of the post office. "Macbeth," Colin called, waving Hamish over with the urgency of a man who had held something in too long. "I've something to tell you. Best done quiet-like." Hamish joined him beneath the shelter. Luggs shook rain onto both their boots. Colin leaned closer, his usually steady voice pitched low. "You know Robbie had a mouth on him, said things without thinking, but he had something on the distillery, something more than bad batches or shoddy work." Hamish folded his arms. "Go on." "They're watering down some of the whiskey, have been for months, covering the losses by destroying barrels that didn't meet mark. Illegal as sin. Robbie found out, caught sight of one of the ledgers, I think." Hamish kept his expression neutral. "And he threatened to report it, or use it to get extra money. I dinna ken which, but folks don't take kindly to blackmail, Hamish, even when it's deserved." Hamish nodded slightly. "Was he in danger?" "Aye." Colin's answer came too quickly. "Folk don't ruin barrels for nothing. Too much money tied up in each one. Someone's covering their tracks." The drizzle softened briefly, replaced by the soft hiss of wind along the street. Villagers hurried past, each wearing that faint look of preoccupation that meant gossip had reached them, but clarity had not. Hamish considered the crofter's words. Robbie blackmailing someone over whiskey dilution fit well with what Willie had hinted earlier, but it didn't sit cleanly with Robbie's fear at the loch, or the stranger's evasiveness at the hotel, or Mrs. McPhee's trembling hands. Too many threads, not enough weaving. "Thanks, Colin," Hamish said. "Keep this quiet." Colin snorted. "In Lochdubh? Quiet? You're dreaming, Macbeth." Hamish smiled faintly. "Aye, maybe I am." He walked on, Lugs trotting ahead as they pass Patel sweeping rainwater from his doorway. At the station cottage, the rattling telephone line caught Hamish's attention. He ducked inside just as it rang with a harsh, uneven buzz, one of those stubborn, late-century landlines that often sounded as though they were transmitting storms more than voices. He lifted the receiver. "Hamish Macbeth." Blair's voice exploded down the line, distorted, irritated, unmistakably Blair. "Macbeth, we've got the toxicology report. Took you long enough to answer the phone. What are you playing at, strolling a boot like some lanky poet while work's to be done?" Hamish leaned against the desk, letting Blair's tirade wash over him like a second storm. "What's the report say, sir?" "Exactly what I told you. Too much whiskey in his system. Man drank himself stupid, simple as that." Blair sounded triumphant, like a dog who'd found a boot and decided it was treasure. Hamish closed his eyes briefly. Robbie wasn't a heavy drinker. "Oh, so you ken more than the lab now," Blair scoffed. "The man's liver was soaked. End of story." Hamish touched the chipped wood sample still in his pocket. Toxicology from Strathbane wasn't subtle. They'd test for alcohol and little else unless pushed. Robbie had smelled faintly of something different, sharper, chemical, and Hamish never ignored his instincts. "Thank you, sir," Hamish said mildly. "You're to stop meddling," Blair snapped. "Daviot's breathing down my neck. You stick to traffic stops and dog complaints." "Yes, sir," Hamish said, entirely without meaning it. He hung up gently, letting the receiver settle in its cradle with a soft click. Luggs stared at him intently, sensing the tension as always. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. "That report's rubbish." Outside, the fog had returned, creeping low across the street as though eavesdropping. Hamish pulled his jacket close and walked toward the loch, the barrel on the moor. Robbie's fear, Mrs. McPhee's late-night meeting, the stranger's evasiveness, Blair's eagerness to close the case. None of it threaded neatly. At the shoreline, the water lapped quietly. Hamish stood still, letting the cold seep into him. Something had been added to that barrel. Not whiskey, not by accident. Robbie hadn't died from drink. He'd died from something else entirely. The mist rolled across the loch, swallowing the far bank. Luggs leaned against him, warm and steady. Hamish watched the fog, thinking. A quiet threat had been sent his way this morning. Folk only sent warnings when the truth grew uncomfortably close. "Someone's frightened of the truth, boy," Hamish said softly, "and frightened folk make mistakes." He turned back toward the village, the faint glow of lights blurred by mist. Tomorrow, the lies would have to crack. But tonight, Lochdubh whispered its secrets only to the fog. The morning settled over Lochdubh in a damp hush, the sort that made every stone glisten and every breath feel touched by mist. Hamish walked the narrow lane toward his cottage with Luggs at his side, both moving with the slow weariness of those who had carried too many half-truths for too long. The village looked deceptively peaceful, peat smoke curling from chimneys, crofters tending to reluctant sheep, the distant chug of a fishing boat drifting across the loch. But beneath the calm lay something taut, stretched thin by gossip and fear. Everyone had lied to him in some way, and Hamish felt each lie tugging at him like invisible threads pulling in opposite directions. Inside his cottage, the peat fire crackled unevenly, offering warmth that barely reached the room's corners. Hamish set a kettle on the hob and dropped into his armchair with the heaviness of a man thinking far too much. Luggs padded forward, nudging Hamish's jacket pocket where the chipped sliver of barrelwood remained. The dog's insistence made Hamish draw it out again. He held the fragment up to the weak morning light. The faint residue on it clung in streaks too deliberate to be accidental. Something industrial, something used with purpose. Not spilled whiskey, but something meant to hide or clean or erase. He ran his thumb across the edge. "Folk are hiding more than their tempers, boy," he murmured. Luggs let out a quiet whine. The kettle hissed just as someone rapped gently on the door. Hamish rose, poured 2 mugs of strong tea without thinking, and opened the door to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe standing there in her elegant coat, its hem already damp with morning mist. She looked composed, as always, but her eyes held a reserved concern that rarely surfaced. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "You're never intruding," Hamish replied with shy honesty. He stepped back to let her in. Luggs wagged his tail once, respectfully, as he always did for her. Priscilla accepted the tea and warmed her hands around the mug. "I've heard whispers," she began softly. "Real ones, not the usual village nonsense. Something is wrong at the distillery. Folk are frightened to say too much. Hamish nodded. Aye, Robbie knew something he shouldn't have, and every person I speak to gives me a truth wrapped in a lie. Priscilla sat near the fire, her posture straight, her calm presence steadying. Tell me, she said, you look as though you've carried the whole moor in your thoughts. Hamish leaned against the mantel, staring into the embers. Mrs. McPhee's business is failing. Pride makes her cagey. The Edinburgh stranger drinks lemonade in a whisky village and muddies his stories as easily as his boots. Robbie's co-workers hide jealousies and Colin hides resentment. And someone bought chemicals from Patel in cash, though nobody admits it. Priscilla listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. It seems everyone has something to protect. Aye, Hamish rubbed the back of his neck. And someone sent me a wee warning on the moor yesterday. Rolled a barrel at me. His tone remained mild, but Priscilla's eyes widened slightly. That's not nothing, Hamish. No, he agreed quietly. It's fear, and fear makes fools act clever. Priscilla set down her cup. What if Robbie wasn't the intended victim? Hamish blinked. Go on. You said the barrel was treated with something odd, something that didn't belong, she continued. Perhaps Robbie wasn't supposed to open it. Perhaps someone else was meant to, someone who regularly handled barrels. Hamish considered this. The distillery manager, the workers who rotated stock, even the stranger if he had access. The barrel had been moved, hidden, cracked open. Too many steps for a simple warning. Lugs trotted forward again, nudging the wood chip. Hamish picked it up slowly, turning it in his fingers. He died because he opened it, Hamish whispered. The truth settled gently, like a fog softening the edges of a loch. No one forced him, no struggle, no marks, just opened the wrong barrel. Priscilla watched him with quiet sympathy, and whoever prepared it didn't expect Robbie to be the one who touched it first. Hamish's thoughts moved in their usual sparse way. The residue, the repainted barrels, Robbie prowling the loch at night, frightened yet determined. Perhaps he'd stumbled onto the truth, tried to prove it, and opened something meant for another. A terrible accident born from lies layered too thickly for anyone to see through. The cottage door rattled suddenly as a gust of wind struck it. Lugs barked once, then trotted to sit closer to Hamish. Outside, the mist darkened as clouds gathered again above Lochdubh. Rain threatened to fall, the kind that blurred edges and muffled sound. It felt like the weather itself breathed along with the investigation, always shifting, always hiding. Hamish set the chipped wood on the table and reached for his coat. I need to go back to the distillery, he said. See which barrels should have been touched yesterday, and which ones were meant to stay sealed. Priscilla rose, smoothing her coat. Walk with me a little first. Her voice held a softness he rarely heard. They stepped outside into the chill air. Hamish closed the door behind him, the peat smoke scent following them faintly onto the lane. They walked side by side down the damp path toward the loch, not touching, not speaking at first. The mist drifted low, brushing the tops of their boots. From across the water, a lone fishing boat hummed steadily, its lantern glowing like a small guardian against the coming storm. Lugs trotted ahead, sniffing the ground, occasionally glancing back to ensure they followed. Robbie wasn't a bad man, Priscilla said finally. I didn't know him well, but he always seemed lost, as though he expected disappointment at every turn. Hamish nodded. Folk like that sometimes find trouble faster than the rest of us. And sometimes trouble finds them. Her voice held the quiet weight of experience. They reached the water's edge. Hamish dipped his hand into the loch, letting the cold bite his skin just enough to sharpen his thinking. Someone meant that barrel for another. If I can find who handled it regularly, I'll ken whose death was meant to look like whisky misfortune. Priscilla studied the ripples spreading across the water. Be careful, whoever did this may be desperate. He gave a small, rueful smile. Folk dinna try to kill me subtle-like. They warn me to stay away. Warnings can turn into something worse, she said, her voice low but steady. Promise me you'll be cautious. Hamish met her eyes briefly, feeling that familiar, unspoken tension settle between them. Aye, I'll try. A distant shout echoed from the direction of Patel's shop, villagers arguing about something trivial. Lochdubh was waking into its usual day of fuss and fretting. Lies tended to scuttle out during such hours like beetles disturbed by a sudden lantern. Priscilla touched his sleeve lightly, an elegant gesture carrying the weight of many words unspoken. "You'll find the truth. You always do." She turned and walked back toward the estate. Hamish watched her go, then whistled for Lugs. The dog bounded to his side, tail flicking once in approval. Hamish strode toward the distillery with renewed purpose, his boots echoing on the damp road. Every suspect had lied, some to protect themselves, others to hide shame or fear. But lies layered too thickly always left seams. At the distillery yard, Agnes Fraser met him with crossed arms, her lips thin. "If you're back to poke about again, Constable, you'll find no answers here." "We'll see," Hamish said mildly, stepping past her. "Folks say Robbie planned to leave Lochdubh." Agnes stiffened. "Aye, and he should have. Caused enough trouble while he was here." "Trouble like finding altered barrels?" Hamish asked gently. She blinked, then looked away. Folk imagine things when business isn't good. Hamish let the silence stretch. Lies always broke in quiet. Lugs nosed the storage door, pouring softly. Hamish opened it and inhaled the faint chemical tang lingering beneath the scent of oak. He lifted one repainted barrel lid slightly, carefully, seeing none of the residue Robbie had encountered. That meant Robbie had touched the one barrel meant for someone else, and someone had prepared it meticulously. Hamish placed the wood chip back in his pocket. "Aye," he whispered to Lugs, "he died because he opened it." The dog whined softly, as though understanding. A cold wind swept through the yard, carrying the smell of the storm rolling in over Lochdubh. Hamish stepped back into the grey light, knowing tomorrow would peel away another layer, and that beneath the lies someone's fear was growing desperate. Mist had returned to Lochdubh with a vengeance, rolling in thick as unwashed wool and swallowing almost every familiar outline. Hamish walked the lock edge slowly, hands deep in his pockets, each step sinking a little into the sodden ground. Lugs padded beside him, the dog's soft footsteps muffled by the wet grass. The world had shrunk to a narrow corridor of grey air and quiet water. Beyond that, nothing existed except memory and unanswered questions. Hamish found he preferred it that way. When visibility closed in, his thoughts opened. Robbie Sinclair had died because he opened a barrel that had been tampered with, treated with something sharp and chemical, something meant to hide watered whiskey. That much Hamish now accepted with the same quiet certainty he accepted rain in Lochdubh. It was simply truth, no matter how inconvenient. But knowing the truth and proving the truth were different beasts entirely. Folk did not confess in Lochdubh without nudging, and nudging required care. Lugs halted abruptly and growled toward the water, as if the loch itself whispered secrets rather than waves. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's head. "Aye, lad, something in there ken more than we do." He continued along the path until the mist thinned enough to reveal Colin Fraser, the crofter, standing by the old jetty, coat hunched high against the cold. He nodded when Hamish approached, eyes narrowed at the swirling fog. "Saw lights here the night Robbie died," Colin murmured without waiting to be asked. "Lantern or torch? Hard to tell. 2 shadows, one taller, one stocky like Robbie. Heard voices, though the wind muddled them." Hamish felt that quiet click inside, the one that meant a piece had moved into place. "Hear anything distinct?" "Only one line. Robbie saying, 'You canny hide it forever.' Sound carried strange, but I'll swear on it." Hamish bowed his head a moment. "Thanks, Colin. That helps." Colin snorted softly. "Don't thank me. Lochdubh will be happier once this mess is sorted. Folk dinna sleep easy with secrets running about like midges." Hamish left him there, staring into the fog as though it owed him an explanation. The path curved back toward the village, where Patel's shop appeared faintly through the haze. The bell above the door jingled as Hamish stepped inside. Patel nearly leaped out of his skin. "Constable, I wasn't expecting you so early." He hurried to straighten a stack of canned goods that required no straightening. His manner was always quick, but today it had the sharp edge of someone rehearsing innocence. "I'm needing to check on something you mentioned," Hamish said mildly. "About the gloves bought last week." Patel blinked rapidly, then nodded. Yes. Rubber gloves. Strong ones. The stranger bought them, the man from the hotel. I remember because he insisted on paying an exact change. Who carries exact change for rubber gloves?" Hamish's expression didn't shift. "Folk who plan ahead. Patel lowered his voice conspiratorially. He asked if we had masks too, not the sick sort, the chemical sort. I said no, of course. This is Lochdubh, not a laboratory. A soft thought nudged Hamish from the inside. Gloves, a barrel, chemical residue. A stranger who never touched whiskey. Hamish thanked Patel and stepped back into the fog, lugs at his heel. Further down the road, the hotel stood like a dim lantern behind its veil of mist. The lounge was empty except for the maid, a wiry young woman named Sheila with quick hands and quicker ears. She paused mid-polish when she saw Hamish. "You're looking for the stranger," she said softly. "Aye." She set the glass down. "I heard him speaking with Mrs. McPhee 2 nights ago, in the passage by the storeroom, voice low but heated, something about debt. He said he couldn't fix numbers forever, that real money had to come from somewhere." Hamish's inner thoughts moved sparsely, quietly arranging themselves. "Did Robbie overhear?" Sheila hesitated. "I think so. He came from the stairs a moment later, white as fresh linen, staring after them. Didn't speak to me, just walked out into the night." Hamish offered her a light nod of thanks and stepped outside again. Mist curled thick around the loch path, embracing Hamish and Lugs as if urging them to continue. Lies had formed a net around Robbie, a net made of pride, desperation and small cowardices. But truth, once started, tightened just as reliably. Hamish made his way to the distillery yard. Mrs. McPhee stood beneath the overhang, hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Her face looked older than it had last week. Worry had a way of carving its initials deeply. "Morning, Hamish," she said quietly. "Morning." He stepped beside her, letting the silence settle just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Folks say Robbie overheard something he shouldn't have," she stiffened. "Folks say too much." "Aye, but some things they say are true." Hamish turned to look at her. The stranger, debt, watered whiskey, a barrel treated to hide it. Mrs. McPhee's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. "I dinna ken what you mean." Hamish didn't push. Pushing frightened people made them cruel. Instead, he let his voice remain calm, almost gentle. "Robbie opened a barrel that was never meant for him." She froze. And in that stillness, Hamish saw everything: fear, regret, and the fragile pride of a woman clinging to a failing business. She hadn't meant Robbie harm, neither had the stranger, but desperation made folk reckless. Before she could speak, a shape emerged from the fog. The Edinburgh stranger approached slowly, his immaculate coat now damp, his confident stride replaced by something subdued. "Constable Macbeth," he said quietly. "May I speak with you?" Mrs. McPhee's eyes closed for a long second. Hamish nodded. The stranger swallowed. "I came here to adjust the accounts. Mrs. McPhee hired me privately. The distillery was losing money. Badly. We started watering small batches to cover the losses, just until we could recover." Mrs. McPhee whispered, "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake." Hamish asked, "And the barrel?" The stranger wiped rain from his forehead. "We used a cleaning agent to mask the dilution. Only a little. But Robbie, he kept sneaking about. I told her he'd ruin everything. She panicked. We hid the treated barrel near the loch. It wasn't supposed to be opened." "But Robbie found it," Hamish said softly. Mrs. McPhee nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. "He must have thought it held proof. He prized it open." Her voice trembled. "We never meant him to die." The fog seemed to hold its breath. Even Lug stood stone still. The stranger whispered, "After we found him, we moved the barrel. Thought if it looked like an accident, no one would question it." Hamish closed his eyes briefly. The truth had emerged slowly, reluctantly, but fully, and as with all truths in Lochdubh, it had hurt someone undeserving. "You'll tell Strathbane?" the stranger asked weakly. Hamish shook his head. "I'll tell them what's needed. No more, no less." Light drizzle began to fall again, soft as regret. Mrs. McPhee wiped her sleeve across her cheek. "Thank you, Hamish." He didn't answer. He simply turned toward the loch, Lugs following, the mist swallowing their silhouettes. Tomorrow would carry its own reckoning, but tonight the truth had tightened its net around the village, and no lie could wriggle free any more. Morning drifted into Lochdubh with a pale, reluctant light, the sort that barely managed to push back the mist veiling the village. The cold clung to everything, the damp stone walls, the grass along the loch path, even the windows of the distillery office where Hamish Macbeth now stood waiting. Lugg settled quietly at his feet, though his tail flicked in restless arcs, sensing the tension that clung to the air like low-lying fog. Hamish rubbed the dog's head, drawing calm from the familiar warmth beneath the coarse fur. Through the wavering glass panes he could see the muted shapes of villagers gathering in the yard. Mrs. McPhee with her stiff shoulders, the Edinburgh stranger avoiding everyone's eyes, 2 distillery workers shifting nervously, and Colin Fraser, hands shoved deep in his pockets as though trying to bury guilt or irritation or both. These were not violent folk, but fear and pride had tangled them into knots, and it was Hamish's duty to unpick them quietly before Strathbane turned the whole affair into a hammer-swinging circus. The office smelled faintly of old paper, malt and damp wool. The single bulb flickered overhead as if even it wished to avoid witnessing what came next. Hamish didn't like forcing truth from people. It felt too much like cornering frightened animals. But today it had to be done. Gently, yes, calmly, but done. When everyone had filed into the cramped room, Hamish closed the door behind them. The murmurs died out, leaving the soft hum of the distillery machinery beyond the wall and the slow tapping of rain against the window. He spoke with the same mild tone he used when soothing a frightened sheep. "Thank ye all for comin'. I ken it's been a difficult week for Lochdubh." Mrs. McPhee's chin jerked slightly, her face pale beneath its usual briskness. The stranger, Grant Wallace, though he had offered that name reluctantly, pressed his lips tight, pushing his spectacles higher up the bridge of his nose. Colin shifted his weight with a grunt. The 2 workers exchanged anxious glances. Hamish stepped forward, his tall frame casting a stretched shadow across the floorboards. Robbie Sinclair died without a struggle. No marks on him, no sign of violence, and Strathbane says Whisky killed him. His tone remained flat, steady. But Whisky didn't he kill Robbie? A ripple of unease spread through the room. Mrs. McPhee's fingers twitched at the edge of her shawl. Hamish continued. Robbie opened a barrel treated with something sharp, an industrial cleaner mixed in to hide the taste and look of watered whisky. Wallace swallowed visibly. The workers froze. Hamish lifted the sliver of wood from his pocket. The room seemed to hold its breath. "This chipped piece has residue on it. The same residue found on Robbie's hands." Mrs. McPhee let out a trembling sigh. "We dinna need the whole tale, Constable. I'll say it plain." She looked older this morning, as though the mist had seeped into her very bones. "I hired him, Grant. The distillery's losses were growing. I thought we could manage it quietly. Patch the accounts, water small batches just to keep the place alive. Only until business picked up." "It was never meant to harm anyone," Wallace added, voice strained. "I told her the chemicals were harmless unless handled improperly. They were meant only to mask the dilution." Colin glared at the accountant. "You both lied. To everyone." Wallace looked away. Hamish raised a hand gently. "Robbie found out, or at least enough to start guessing. He overheard a conversation by the loch. He confronted you, Mrs. McPhee?" "Aye." Her voice cracked. "He said he'd expose us, unless we gave him money. I panicked. Grant panicked. We hid one of the treated barrels, out by the water. It was never meant to be touched. It was meant to buy us time." "He opened it," Wallace whispered. "He thought it held proof. He prized the lid, and the fumes." "He never had a chance," Mrs. McPhee said, voice breaking completely. "We found him slumped beside it, and we were so terrified we staged the scene at the lockside to look like he'd fallen, or drunk too much." The workers backed away slightly, their faces drawn with shock. Colin muttered a curse in Gaelic under his breath. Luggs let out a low growl, not at the people but at the thick atmosphere of fear and regret. Hamish nodded slowly, letting the confession settle. "I ken you never meant to kill him, but lies have long legs, and fear has longer ones." A thunderous knock rattled the door, and without waiting for permission, Detective Chief Inspector Blair barged into the room, Anderson scuttling behind him with notebook in hand. Blair smelled of impatience and cheap aftershave, his expression already arranged into something triumphant and smug. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, "seems you've gathered quite the audience. I suppose you're ready to hand me the culprit so I can close this case properly." Hamish didn't move. "Aye, sir, I'm ready to explain." Blair puffed out his chest, clearly preparing for a dramatic accusation. Hamish continued in the same calm voice. Robbie Sinclair died from inhaling vapours of a cleaning agent used to disguise watered whiskey. Mrs. McPhee and Mr. Wallace were responsible for the dilution. They hid the barrel, but Robbie opened it accidentally. He died without violence. They panicked, staged the scene, and lied out of fear. Blair blinked, once, twice. Then his face contorted, trying to twist the explanation into something he could claim credit for. Well, that's exactly what I suspected. Just needed to let Macbeth here gather the small details, of course. He turned to Anderson. Write that doon, and write that I led the investigation. Anderson scribbled eagerly, eyes darting between Blair and Hamish like an obedient terrier. But before Blair could continue his preening, the office doorway darkened with another presence. Superintendent Davitt himself, looking weary and rain-soaked, but sharply aware of everything occurring in the room. Blair, Davitt said crisply, do be quiet. Blair froze, mouth half open. Davitt stepped fully inside, surveying the assembled villagers. Constable Macbeth, please proceed. Hamish repeated his findings succinctly, letting his quiet authority fill the room in a way Blair's bluster never could. Mrs. McPhee and Wallace lowered their heads, accepting responsibility without further protest. Davitt exhaled heavily. A tragic business. Foolish. Desperate. But Macbeth has handled it with the necessary delicacy. He cast a glare at Blair. Which is more than I can say for others. Blair's ears went scarlet. Hamish felt none of the triumph others might have in such a moment, only a familiar, subdued tiredness. He was glad the truth had been spoken, but uncovering it had cost Lochdubh dearly. Suspicion, fear, and the death of a man who had merely stepped too close to something rotten. Davitt instructed Anderson to escort Wallace and Mrs. McPhee outside for formal statements. No shouting, no handcuffs, no spectacle. Hamish appreciated that. Lochdubh did not need more shame today. When the room had emptied, Hamish leaned against the cold window frame. The distillery yard blurred through the mist. Damp ground, bowed roofs, villagers who had already begun spreading the story in murmured fragments. Lugs padded beside him, resting his head gently against Hamish's knee. A quiet unmasking, Hamish whispered. The only kind Lochdubh will tolerate. He straightened his coat, ran a tired hand through his red hair, and took one last look at the loch beyond the window. The water lay still, pretending innocence beneath the fog. Secrets always found their way there. Tomorrow there would be paperwork he hated, Blair's tantrums, Davitt's political tidying, gossip swirling through the village like smoke from damp peat. But for now, only silence remained, soft, uneasy, and somehow familiar. Hamish stepped outside with Lugs at his side, walking into the mist that curled like a final reminder. Truth in Lochdubh was never loud, never clean, never kind, only necessary. Dusk drifted over Lochdubh with the softness of a sigh, tinting the sky a muted violet before the mist crept in to swallow the last traces of colour. The air carried the clean, cold scent of recent rain. Along the loch edge, ripples glimmered faintly, disturbed only by the quiet glide of a lone duck heading nowhere in particular. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the familiar path, Lugs at his side, both moving with the unhurried rhythm of those who had nothing more to chase and nothing left to hide. The village of Lochdubh had begun folding itself into evening. Windows glowed amber from peat fires within, and the faint clatter from Patel's shop sign tapped at intervals in the mild breeze. A couple of crofters trudged homeward, boots coated in mud, nodding to Hamish with subdued respect. Gossip still hummed low in the air. Gossip always did in Lochdubh, but the sharper tones had dulled into something softer, almost sympathetic. The truth of Robbie Sinclair's death had settled at last, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the quiet resignation Lochdubh understood well. Hamish paused at the jetty, watching mist drift across the water in small curling shapes. Lugs pressed closer, sensing a heaviness in his master's chest. Robbie had been a man pulled between pride and desperation, always expecting life to disappoint him. And in the end, life had obliged. Hamish crouched to rest a hand on Lugs's head. Folk dinna mean harm half the time, he murmured. They only make foolish choices and hope the world will forgive them. Lugs let out a soft, sympathetic wuff. Lights flickered on in the distillery yard farther along the road. Earlier, Strathbane officers had escorted Mrs. McPhee into their car with a gentleness rarely seen from their ranks, and Grant Wallace had been ushered out not long after, his immaculate coat clinging damply to his shoulders. No shouting, no manhandling. Davitt had insisted on decorum, likely for his own reputation's sake. Blair had fumed and sputtered, but even he hadn't dared disturb the sombre air thickening over Lochdubh. Now the yard lay quiet again, save for the faint metallic creak of a wind-tug chain on a gate. Hamish nodded once toward it, an unspoken farewell to a place that had held more trouble than Whisky of late. He turned toward home. The station cottage welcomed him with the faint smell of peat smoke lingering beneath the rafters. Inside, he hung his damp jacket beside the door and bent to light the fire. Sparks crackled eagerly, throwing warm light in uneven patterns across the small room. It was a cosy enough space, untidy, mismatched furniture, teacups that never seemed fully dry. But to Hamish it was home. Familiar, honest. Lugg circled twice before settling beside the hearth, sighing with that deep dog contentment that tugged a small smile from Hamish. He poured himself a mug of tea, sat heavily in his worn armchair, and let the warmth seep into his fingers. Robbie's face flickered across his thoughts. Not the pale stillness of the man discovered beside the barrel, but a memory of him laughing at the hotel bar months ago, cheeks flushed, shoulders loose for once. A good laugh, then. A rare one. Hamish held on to that version. Death stole enough. It shouldn't steal kindness, too. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Hamish rose, opening it to find Priscilla Halberton-Smythe standing there, her coat gathered close, a light mist on the wool. She offered him one of her gentle, reserved smiles, small enough to disappear if one blinked, but unmistakably real. "I wanted to check on you," she said simply. "You did nae need tae," Hamish replied, though his voice softened despite himself. "I know." She stepped inside as he held the door. Luggs greeted her with a calm wag of his tail, recognizing the unique place she held in Hamish's small world. Priscilla moved toward the fire, warming her gloved hands. "I passed the distillery on my way. It felt quiet." Hamish nodded. "Folk will take time to settle. It's no small thing, losing someone, even someone as uncertain as Robbie." Priscilla tilted her head slightly, her gaze settling on him with gentle insight. "And you? Will you settle?" Hamish hesitated. His thoughts rarely spilled into words. He preferred the privacy of silence, the clarity of walking the moor alone. But with Priscilla, silence often said too much. "I'll be fine," he said softly. "Just tired." She moved closer, not touching him, not intruding, just quietly present, as she always was when his loneliness grew too still to hide. "You did right by the village, Hamish. They know it." He let out a short, self-conscious breath. Sometimes right doesn't feel much different from wrong, only quieter. Priscilla's lips curved in something close to fondness. "That's because you carry things too gently." Hamish cleared his throat, suddenly shy. "Would you like tea?" "No, I won't stay long. I only wanted to see how you were." She drew in a slow breath as though steadying something inside her. "Good night, Hamish." "Good night," he replied. He walked her to the door. Outside, the mist wrapped around her as she descended the small path. For a moment, her silhouette blurred, then disappeared entirely. Hamish lingered there, watching the soft glow from her taillights fade into the highland dusk. When he closed the door, the cottage felt both emptier and warmer, as if the fire had quietly absorbed the echo of her presence. He returned to his armchair. Luggs rose, padded over, and pressed his body firmly against Hamish's leg. The constable stroked the dog's head slowly. "That's it, lad," he murmured. "It's just us again." The fire crackled with that small, comforting sound of peat shifting as it burned. Outside, the wind lifted, sweeping across the loch with a lonely hum. The rain, gentle now, tapped at the window as though reminding him that life in Lochdubh flowed on, steady as ever, with sorrows and consolations braided together. Hamish leaned back, his gaze settling on the flames. Another life lost, another truth uncovered, another quiet acceptance settling into the bones of a Highland night. But for now, just now, he sat with Luggs and listened to the wind soften over the loch, the world outside wrapped once more in mist, and felt the smallest flicker of peace.